Today I'm going to attempt to revive and upgrade an old network-attached storage device that is set in the back of a closet unused and unpowered for more than 10 years. As you might expect, especially if you watch some of my other videos, all does not go as planned. Hi and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. Now this video might be a little bit off topic for my channel, but I do occasionally publish a video about how to repair or upgrade something. For example, one of my older videos shows how to replace and upgrade a battery in a PS4 controller. I also have a video where I diagnose and repair an error on my slot machine. I also love to revive or upcycle old technology, potentially finding new uses for it. As a part of this process, I try to show the troubleshooting tips and maybe some ideas of what to do if something doesn't go quite right. And usually something doesn't. Well, this video covers all the above. In fact, a large chunk of this video is going to actually be me trying things that didn't work. If you launch this video because you are looking at how to potentially upgrade an old network drive, especially a Buffalo TeraStation, then you might want to use the links down here in the timeline or the video description to jump ahead on the section on upgrading the drives, which is a method that finally worked for me. But along the way, you can see a lot of things that didn't work and the troubleshooting steps that I took to try to resolve it. This is a Buffalo TeraStation Live. I bought this in late 2012 or early 2013 and used it for a couple of years as a backup for my consulting business files. But eventually I'd move on and transition to a couple of newer Synology devices. This TeraStation went into the back of a closet where it's sat untouched for at least 10 years. It does have 4 drive bays, and this early model could support up to 250 gigabyte per bay for a total storage capacity of 1 terabyte when used in a non-RAID configuration. And I do have old 250 gig 3.5-inch platter hard drives in this system, so it is currently maxed out for storage space. Not a whole lot interesting on the back, but there are a couple of USB ports. If I recall, this actually had a print server built in, so you could hook up a USB printer and print over your network. It has a single Ethernet port, and it actually has a hookup here for a battery backup to keep this powered in the event of a power failure. So my primary goals for this particular project is first to see if this system will even power on after sitting for more than 10 years. Then I want to see, can I access the device over my network? I seem to recall setting a static IP on the device itself back in the day, and if that's the case, there's a good possibility that the IP address on here is going to conflict with the device already on my network, so I have to see if I can work around that. And then, of course, see if I can actually access any of the files on these old hard drives. If I can, then I could pull any files I want to keep, although, again, that's probably unlikely after 10 or more years, and I could wipe the system. I consider replacing these old platter drives with solid-state drives, and I'd have a third, albeit likely slow, backup device for archiving things like document images or videos. Alternatively, I could replace the default firmware with full Debian Linux. Then I could do things like install Docker and apps. There is a GitHub repo with code and instructions to do this. Interestingly, this document also talks about a secondary microcontroller that's used on these older models for things like the power button, the menu, and the display. That might be interesting to look at, play with, or even replace with something like an ESP32. To be honest, I have no idea where this video is going to go at this point, or if it will end up being a video at all. But I wanted to go ahead and film this initial process in the event something interesting happens. Okay, the only thing I've done here is I've connected an Ethernet cable to the TeraStation and to a network switch here on my desk, and I've plugged in the power cord. That's the only thing I've done. So the big test here at first is simply to see if the system will power on. And it at least looks like it's attempting to boot at this point. And I'm guessing here, I think I had this set up, I'm trying to remember, RAID 5 maybe? I know I had the disks mirrored in here, so part of the reason it may be taking quite some time here is it's trying to do a check on that RAID array to make sure that everything is good. We will let this go ahead and continue to run for a little bit and come back if anything interesting happens. Okay, we can now see it is a 1 gigabit here, and it's now showing all 4 hard drives used. I did just get a beep. Okay, so yeah, we just get a RAID error here. So we have a number of error and warning lights on here. And it does have an IP address, and I guarantee you that .9 is already used on my network. So I know I'm not going to be able to access it over the network, at least not right now. By some weird coincidence, I actually did not have a .9 device on my network. So I can actually come over here and I can actually ping this, and I am getting a reply. So it is actually on my network. And I can see the device on my network. So by going to the IP address in a browser, I get this, which is going to be my first stumbling block. I have no idea what the username and password is here. So now I'm going to have to do a little research and see if I have old notes somewhere that will remind me what my login to this device is. Well, luckily I was actually able to guess the old user ID and password. So much for not reusing passwords. Apparently I'm still using them from 10 years ago, but I am into the interface. It does seem to be really slow to come up, and that may have something to do with that array error. So we're going to see if we can get this RAID error fixed first. So I got this page to come up. It says it will let me restructure the array by selecting the disk, and we're going to try this and see if we can repair the RAID array. Just to pop in here real quick to show you that the RAID array is rebuilding. It's one of the advantages of using RAID. If you have a drive that fails, all of your data is spread out and you can actually rebuild that array. So again, this is going to take a while, so I'll let that run and we'll come back when it's complete, and maybe we'll get lucky and all of our error messages will be gone. And a couple other things as the RAID array continues to rebuild. My red error is now gone. I'm still working in a degraded format here, but it is still rebuilding the array. And you can see from here on the screen, I was running RAID 5 on this, and that gives me about 3/4 of the total capacity. So instead of a full terabyte, I have about 750 gigabyte total storage in here because I am running that RAID 5 array. And one other quick update, I happened to find this screen. It's been so long since I used this TeraStation, I really don't remember anything about the interface. But you can see here, while this has been running for quite some time, it's still only 1.3% complete. Still has a whopping 294 minutes to go. So this is going to be actually a 6 to 7 hour process. So I'm just going to walk away, let this run, come back and see what we've got after the RAID array rebuilds. Well, it actually took overnight, so I'm not sure how long it took, but it was a long time. But the array has successfully rebuilt, and now I'm seeing no errors on the device or in the web interface itself. But I have noticed that it is relatively slow to respond. It's not horrible, but it does work. I did run into a little issue when I attempted to map a drive to the TeraStation in Windows. This unit is so old it still uses the SMB1 protocol, which is considered insecure at this point and is therefore disabled in Windows by default. So I had to manually enable client-side SMB1, which is okay for a bit, but not something I want to leave long term. But with that enabled, I can map a drive and I can see all of the original data. And as far as I can tell at this point, all the data is still good. In fact, you can see I'm only using about 64 gigabyte of the total storage, so I can easily copy everything off of this onto something like a 128 gig USB thumb drive and still have a backup. I'm going to do this because I may consider replacing all of these 10-plus-year-old hard drives, possibly with solid-state drives, and also updating or replacing the firmware to support SMB2 or later, so that I don't need to keep SMB1 enabled. With everything working, I did copy all of my existing files over to a 64 gig USB thumb drive. This also took multiple hours, so I know that this system just doesn't have the horsepower of my new Synologies. It's definitely not going to be my day-to-day network storage system. In addition, within a day of operation, an error popped up on drive 4 again. This is definitely going to need to be replaced. And after giving it just a little bit of thought, and since I have all my files backed up to a thumb drive, I opted to just order 4 new drives and replace them all due to the age of the originals. And in fact, when I was going back through some of my old hard drives, I actually found this drive 3 that I'd replaced at one point in time due to a failure. And this actually gives me another fallback. If things go horribly wrong, I can always put the original drives back in. Now, ideally, you want matching drives, but I don't know when the last time you shot for 3.5-inch physical platter drives, but it's a little hard to find new and not reconditioned drives in less than terabyte capacities. Well, these were sold as new, and from what I can tell, based on the packaging, they appear not to be used. But I guess you never know for sure. The only thing not ideal in this case is that all 4 drives are from the same batch. And in a perfect world, you want the drives to be from different batches so they'd be less likely to experience the same failure at the same time. Well, some later models of the TeraStations actually feature something called hot swappable drives, which means if you have a failing drive, you can actually remove one and replace it while the system remains up and running, and assuming you're running RAID on your drives. But this older model actually does not have hot swappable drives. Doesn't really matter because we're going to replace all 4 of them anyway, but it does feature something called quick swappable drives, which means to replace the drive, it's very easy. We just undo this, pull the drive out, disconnect these cables, and we can simply swap out this drive with a new one. Once the drives are removed, then it's a very simple process of removing these 4 retaining or mounting screws from the old drive, and then simply putting in the new drive and replacing the screws. Now, an interesting fact here with these TeraStations is the fact that part of the operating system actually lives on the hard drives themselves. So that means by swapping out all 4 drives here, when I first power up the system, it's not going to have any sort of operating system on it. So we're going to have to determine whether we want to try to put the TeraStation application back onto this, or whether we do want to look at new firmware at this point. But again, once all of those are removed, that simply comes off. We can take the new drive, and it ought to line up with the same mounting holes. And all we need to do now is simply replace these 4 screws. Okay, this drive is now ready to go back into the system. I just have to repeat that same process for the other 3 drives. With all 4 drives now labeled and replaced with the new drives, all I've got to do is put each of these trays back into the TeraStation. And what's nice here is the fact that each tray and each cable is numbered, so you really can't get things connected wrong as long as you pay attention. We just need to get our cable lined up here in the back, which is a little easier said than done. I'm trying to work over the top of the camera. But we will get that inserted in there like that. And then our tray simply slides in until it snaps into place. You'll feel it and hear it. Close the door and repeat with the last one. Okay, so that completes the hardware swap. Now, what I don't know, since there's no operating system or even part of the firmware installed on these drives, what's going to happen when I turn it on, and how in the heck do I get firmware back on it? That's what we need to find out next. Okay, with all my original drives still here, plus all of my files backed up onto this thumb drive, the new drives are in here. I've reconnected the Ethernet, and let's go ahead and power it on and see what happens. Now, I'm going to suspect that when you buy this system brand new, it doesn't come with drives, and you would put all of the existing or all new drives in here. And at some point, I would assume that you're going to need to flash the firmware as well. Okay, and there we go. We have a weird IP address, 11.50, which is not my IP address. I need to look into how you would originally flash the firmware onto this if the system was brand new. Okay, from what I can remember, and by looking online, the way you originally set this thing up was downloading this utility called NAS Navigator 2. And apparently, it's supposed to be able to find and flash the firmware to your system. I'm searching for devices on the network, and I'm not finding anything. Okay, I initially thought maybe it wasn't showing up because I had went back in and I disabled this SMB 1.0, hoping that maybe a new version of firmware I wouldn't need it. But I re-enabled it, rebooted the machine, and I'm still not finding it on my network, which would be expected because it's on a different subnet of .11 instead of .1. Then I finally remembered that when you initially set this up, you have to connect it directly to a machine like a laptop, change the subnet on the laptop to be able to initially set the machine up. So now that's what I'm going to do next. Connecting to a laptop didn't help. I still cannot connect directly to or find the TeraStation with the NAS Navigator. However, what little bit of info I could find, it indicated that the boot record and firmware actually resides on the hard drive. These are unformatted drives. So I removed drive 1 and created an initial 512 megabyte partition simply formatted with NTFS. Okay, I've reinstalled the formatted hard drive, so let's power this thing up again and see if we get any different results. Well, so far everything looks exactly the same. Let's silence that. But now, more importantly, let's see if we can find it in the Navigator. And as you can see, there's absolutely no difference of having the NTFS format on this first drive. I'm still unable to find it in the NAS Navigator, and I still have the same error message here. So that means we're probably going to have to go to the next step and use Linux. So simply formatting the hard drive did not work, and do note that I did go back and remove that original partition and recreate it with both FAT32 and exFAT with the same results. So it looks like I'm going to have to go to this next step, and this is probably my last effort to try to get the original Buffalo firmware back onto this device. And that's going to involve using Linux to format this as ext3, and it's also going to involve manually copying all of the firmware files over to that partition on the hard drive. Now, unfortunately for me, all of my Linux instances are in Proxmox VMs, but I'm going to create a bootable thumb drive with Linux on it and use my laptop to try to create these steps. Note that in addition to this, I'm also going to need some additional software, which is this ACP commander, which can be downloaded and installed from here on GitHub. Okay, luckily I did find an old laptop that had Linux installed on it, so I was able to use that to go ahead and create a 512 meg partition on this, format it with ext3, and copy the source code files, or copy the firmware files over to that drive. So let's fire this up and see if we get anything different. Ideally, what we want to see here is we want to see it enter EM or emergency mode. Well, again, we're going to see at this point if it can even read anything off that hard drive where I copy those files over. Yep, and we've got the same exact error message where it can't seem to find any kind of boot information off of that hard drive. So I'm kind of stuck at this point. I'm not sure what to do. May go out to the Discord server and see if I can get someone else to help me out here, because obviously I'm doing something wrong and I am not a Linux expert. So after doing a little bit more digging, I did have a couple of other ideas, including getting out an old router and setting up a dedicated .11 network, using a TFTP client to try to push the firmware files over. But instead at this point, I decided to try a different process, and that included putting the old original drives back in again, which you can see here. Now the nice thing about this is it now gives me access back to the web interface of the device. And so now what I can do is I can actually replace 3 of the hard drives, keeping the original drive in here that has the firmware installed. Then when I format these other drives, it actually puts a copy of that firmware on each of these 3 drives, which then allows me to swap out the original first drive with one of the new ones. Now this is a much more time-consuming process, which is why I was kind of avoiding trying to go down this route. But to be honest, all the time I've spent trying to get the firmware back onto here, I probably could have started out with this method and got it done just as quick. So the first thing I need to do is I need to go in and remove or break this current RAID. Because if I'm going to swap out hard drives, I don't want this particular RAID to rebuild. So I'm going to go into my RAID setup. I'm going to select this array. And of course, I've got an error here in this RAID array anyway. I could swap out that 4th drive and rebuild it. We're actually going to delete the RAID array in this particular case. So as you can see here, the RAID array is being removed. But at this point, I can't do anything else. I just have to let the system sit. So I'll keep an eye on how long this takes and let you know when it's finished. Okay, at this point, the array has been removed. That actually only took about 3 or 4 minutes to do. We'll go ahead and click the continue button here. Okay, now you see we no longer have a RAID array defined here. It is still showing over here that my disk 4 is faulty, but that's fine because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove 3 out of the 4 of these disks. Okay, so what I've done at this point is I've replaced these 3 bottom drives, 2 through 4, with the new hard drive, but drive number 1 still has the original hard drive, which should have a copy of the firmware. So we should be able to boot this up without getting that error on the missing of the boot sector. Okay, that's a good sign because normally we would have already gotten the error message. Okay, everything looks so good so far. No error messages. I do see that it's reading off of disk 1 here, so it does appear to be reading the firmware. Okay, it is showing me a brief error here on the drives because, again, those drives have not been formatted, so it is putting up a warning error message. But here's the good news. I'm still able to access the web interface, which means that the firmware is still there. And notice it's telling me disks 2, 3, and 4 are unformatted. I can simply click on one of those, and it's going to take me over to the format options. So I'm going to have to go through each one of these disks 2 through 4 and go ahead and format those. So we will go ahead and start that process here. Now, I expect that this is going to take a little bit of a while. So I'm going to go ahead and start the format on this disk 2. We'll let that run, enter in a confirmation number here, because obviously all the data on the disk is going to be deleted, but these are brand new disks. And then I will go ahead and repeat that same process for disks 3 and 4. Okay, as you can see, all 4 hard drives are now formatted. It really didn't take that long, about 3 or 4 minutes per disk. And notice that my bottom 3 are all showing the 500 gig drive, while I still have the 250 gig drive in the original. Now, when I formatted these, a copy of the firmware was supposed to be placed onto each disk. This should mean that theoretically I can now replace disk 1 and still have the firmware intact. Yeah, I've now went ahead and swapped out the original first hard drive with one of my new ones. And if the documentation is to be believed, even though there is no firmware on this, it should have made a copy of firmware on these other drives. So when it can't find it here, it ought to look to the next drive to get the firmware. So we're going to go ahead and power this on. Again, here are all the original drives. These now have actually been erased, but all my original files from these drives are on this USB thumb drive. We'll let that boot up and see what kind of messages we get. Hopefully we won't get the message that it can't find the firmware. Let that finish booting up and we'll try pulling up the web interface. Okay, finally some promising news. We've got it all back in there. I do have this red indicator light, which is indicating disk 1, but it shows here that disk 1 is unformatted. So we're just going to quickly format that just like we did the other ones. And again, this will only take 2 to 3 minutes to do. So we will go ahead and start the format of disk 1. Okay, the format of that first hard drive completed successfully. And now you see I've got 4 drives, all at 500 gigabyte capacity. So at this point, it would be just like a brand new TeraStation. I will go in, set up RAID again, create my shared folders, and any other settings that I previously had set up before. Also note, I have the same original IP address that I had previously, so that still came across, but that's a router reservation that makes that work. And I did go through and make screenshots of all of my different settings, so it ought to be easy to recreate those with these new hard drives. It took a few hours for the RAID array to rebuild and sync, but once complete, I moved the now fully functional unit to its new home, nestled between 3 of my 4 Proxmox servers and next to one of my 2 Synology boxes. And as you can see, not only is the RAID array repaired, but I've doubled the capacity from the original 750 gigabytes to 1.5 terabytes. In addition, the device is now found and shown in the NAS Navigator utility. So based on my own experiences in restoring this device, I've decided not to attempt to install Linux or other types of alternate firmware, as this device just simply does not have the horsepower to run applications at an acceptable level. To be honest, it's even pretty slow for storing files that I might want to access on a daily basis, especially when compared to something like the Synologies that I have. So I've decided I'll use this device for longer term or almost like cold storage for important files that I don't need to access on a regular basis. This might be things like tax returns or master copies of my videos, things that I want to make sure I've got multiple redundant backups of. I can use this for a 3rd or even a 4th backup location. But it's not something I'm probably going to use on a daily basis. It's just simply too old and too slow. Well, this video didn't end up the way I thought it would when I first started. And I'm sure someone with more Linux experience than I have, which isn't a lot, could have figured out the way to actually write those firmware files to one of those blank drives and make it work. But honestly, as long as the original system boots, then doing the process where I upgraded the drives that copied the firmware to each drive as they were formatted is probably the way to go for a device of this age. You simply cannot find updated files and firmware for these devices because support is no longer offered. I'll be back soon with more videos on DIY electronics, LEDs, and home automation. But until that time, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.